Hi guys, so welcome to part 3 of this series, and today it's going to be a biggie. We're looking at story structure, so I would definitely advise you to make yourselves comfortable and grab some snacks because this is going to be a big one. So in the last video I talked about how your game system or your game concept can serve as the foundations for your game book. So with that kind of analogy in mind, your story essentially becomes the framework or superstructure which rests on top, and essentially the columns and beams that support everything else. And yes, even with a game book where we have ridiculous branching narratives and a myriad of choices, I would say it's still really important to at least have or to deliver a overarching story, or be aware of the story beats that will help you to create a satisfying narrative experience for your reader. So, let's dive straight in. Timestamps again in the description below if you want to revisit any sections. I will be going through quite a lot in this video, but I believe all of this is really important to know as a storyteller. It's what we're looking at is really kind of the bread and butter of writing. And as game book writers, sometimes we have to kind of break the rules a little bit, but to kind of break the rules, you have to know the rules first. So it's really important to understand how story structure works in a traditional sense before we, have to move things around or smash things with a hammer and, rejig things to suit the story that we're trying to tell. So there are many different sort of story structure blueprints to follow. I mean, you can do a Google search, you can find many examples online. In this video, I'm choosing to look at the 3-act story structure. I think it's the one that is probably the most familiar to a lot of people. It was the one that was the most familiar to me. It's the one that I used to help me with The Legion of Shadow and The Heart of Fire, which both have a 3-act narrative structure. And then I was forced to adapt it quite significantly for Eye of Winter's Fury and my other game books, which I will be talking about actually, and how I went about that. So with the 3-act structure, you'll see from this diagram that we have, so each kind of act starts with a major sort of story beat or transitional event. So, we begin Act 1 with exposition, which is setting out, the character situation. We have a sort of first major plot drop or plot dump at the end of Act 1 that takes us into Act 2. Act 2 usually ends with a situation of failure and testing for the hero, which then sort of pushes us through into Act 3, which is obviously building towards the climax. You'll see from hopefully the beautiful diagram that Diogo's done for me that each act is a wave of rising action and falling action. And with each wave growing in size and intensity as we sort of ramp up the tension and the challenges faced by our protagonist. So let's take a look at Act 1. So we start with what is known as exposition. It sets out the main character's situation. In a way, it answers those kind of obvious questions of who, what, why, where, etc. So we get a sense of who they are, where they are, what they're all about, and why they're in their current circumstances. This is your kind of ground zero. Then, as we're sort of moving up the kind of curve of storytelling tension, the rising action, we move towards what is known as the inciting incident, which is typically the big moment of Act 1. This is the incident that throws the character out of their comfort zone. It's the thing that propels them into their grander journey, although they might not necessarily be aware of that. So it basically presents the protagonist with a problem, an obstacle, and a goal that they must complete. Now, I'm going to argue straight off the bat that for a game book, The inciting incident is pretty much where you start. We don't need to spend a lot of time on establishing, any kind of exposition or action. We want to get to that sort of motivation for our character, and in this case, it's going to be our reader, ASAP, to launch them straight into the book before we start hurling a million and one choices in their direction. So I would move this down the arc, as you will see, to much nearer to the beginning. And probably then your Act 1 would actually be a kind of series of these incidents that potentially scale in significance towards kind of more of a major challenge or major inciting incident that kind of really sort of tests our hero at the end of the kind of Act 1 and how they might have started their growth on this journey. And that will bring us into a sort of plot drop at the end of Act 1. Plot drop is often referred to as, in screenwriting, as the kind of threshold moment. It's when the protagonist gets a sense of the bigger picture, of realizing kind of what is actually going on. And it's called the threshold because they're kind of making that step over from their old life to the new. So it's kind of that character making the conscious decision to continue their journey. It's the point of kind of no return, of no going back. And that is kind of your starting point for what would be Act 2. Again, Act 2, we ramp up the action as the hero sets out with new goals and a fresh perspective. And then Act 2 usually, will introduce a massive spanner in the works. It's that kind of shock moment that throws everything off course. And I'm calling it the whoopsie moment. It's that kind of unexpected event that the hero doesn't kind of really see coming. And great if the reader doesn't see it coming either. That's the usually the intent. And this is great for storytelling because, following this kind of dramatic moment that you're going to, throw in to your book, we then lead into what sort of screenplay writers call the dark night of the soul, which sounds rather dramatic, but it's the end of Act 2 where it's a kind of that moment of when everything feels lost and that the hero doesn't, everything's against them. The odds feel overwhelming, and it's when, the hero has to kind of dig deep to, find that courage to press on when they could just give up. And obviously is the starting point for, transitioning into Act 3, which is obvious, I think is self-explanatory in that you're moving towards your epic climax. It's the face-off moment, the confrontation or the culmination of the journey. You're ramping up the tension, to ensure that everybody, the reader, characters, everybody knows exactly what is at stake. And then following that, we move into the ending. So this is where we kind of discover the repercussions of the climax. So all the kind of changes that might have happened. So it's kind of the tying up, I suppose, of loose ends. Not only for the characters, but also for your world. I mean, your world state might have changed depending on, what the climax was. I add a question mark here because endings, as we know, are sometimes new beginnings. It might hint at other adventures to come and stories to come. So it's an ending of sorts, isn't it? I get that I talked about that a lot in detail, but I think whatever you're writing, it's important to always have a sense of that style of structure. And if you went away and you analysed, your favourite books, your movies, even games with a strong storytelling element, you will see that kind of blueprint underlines, the writing. And you'd also, if you look at a kind of trilogies, they tend to follow that too. In fact, you could say that The Empire Strikes Back, for example, is a whole massive whoopsie moment leading into that dark night of the soul with the ending of that, which launches into Return of the Jedi, which is, in a lot of sense, a kind of a huge climax, really. So I applied this 3-act structure to my first 2 game books, because it really helped me to kind of build that narrative journey. Even though I was introducing lots of choices and different quests, etc., I always tried to keep my overarching narrative in mind. When it came to Iron Winter's Fury and my later game books, sort of due to kind of practical restraints and costs, I had to drop to 2 maps, 2 acts in those books, which forced me to think differently about this 3-act blueprint, because it no longer sort of slipped easily into my sort of structure. So I adapted it, and in some ways this might be more of the structure that you would want to follow for a typical game book. So let's just take a look at this. So we're now down to 2 acts, but you'll see some very common elements. So, as I've mentioned previously, with a game book, we don't really need a lot of exposition. So you kind of want to get to that inciting incident as soon as you can at the start of the book. If you think about I Winter's Fury, and I don't think this is really a spoiler because it's in the prologue, but if you think about Prince Aaron and his situation, his convoy gets ambushed within the first 3 pages of the book, 2 pages of the book, and that's the inciting incident that leads our hero out of his comfort zone and onto his journey. As I said, I told it in the prologue, got it out of the way, and within that I'd also kind of set up who he was, why he was there, and a lot about his character. This Prince Aaron is who the reader is taking on and leading through this adventure. So we already know what the stakes are. We know the stakes are high. We've grabbed the reader's attention. So your inciting incident really is just, get it out there, ASAP. And then, as you see, we've got the rising action taking us towards potentially what is going to be our first sort of big challenge for our hero. It might be another dramatic story event or encounter that propels them towards a fresh goal or gives them a fresh purpose. And now, as I mentioned before with the 3-act structure, traditionally our whoopsie moment would be Act 2. But, because we're kind of compacted now into 2 acts, I find it quite useful to have that kind of spanner in the works moment coming into towards the end of Act 1 as a kind of, I suppose, sucker punch, or a kind of a moment to just kind of, shock the reader, bring some drama, and that can usually then lead quite nicely into what could be your sort of first sort of plot drop or plot dump. Yeah, and your first plot drop, again, this could probably combine with that kind of dark night of the soul moment, where at the end of your sort of Act 1, your hero can feel somewhat bewildered and that everything's against them, and then you kind of then got launching them into Act 2 as potentially a stronger character that has to sort of dig deep. Act 2, again, we're moving to a climax with the big encounter, but on the way, you have a whole act now. So that's where I would probably throw in another whoopsie moment. You can never have too many whoopsies, is my motto, but these ramp up the tension again. They'll, and it's kind of like forcing your hero to dig deep and setting up that kind of drama ready for the major climax. And then, obviously then we move to your sort of typical ending and the wrap up. I've gone into this structure in detail because it helps to know these narrative beats. And so when it comes to writing, you can set out these kind of story beats as we've already identified and use them to help you with planning your framework. So if we sort of zoom in now to what would be my Act 1 of my 2-act structure. So we've got the inciting incident, we have our sort of first story challenge, stroke character development moment. Then we have a whoopsie event, and for the sake of argument, because we're doing game books here, there might be 2 different whoopsie events, depending on the choices you've made, and then they come together to lead you to the final part of Act 1, which is your kind of narrative plot drop. So I think it's just kind of useful from a visual standpoint to have that in your head, to know, okay, so this is my act one and these are my major stepping stones. Now, it's not important necessarily to have these super fleshed out in detail, but like I said, just have them in the back of your mind. I actually call them islands, and I'll explain why in a minute, but these are going to become super crucial when it comes to actually, once you start introducing a lot of choices and branching narrative. So, and to do this, let's zoom in again to a section of this. So we're now between inciting incident and the first story challenge or character development moment. So you can see that the things we've identified before, these kind of big story beats, I call them islands, and these are the sort of the big circles you see in the diagram. These are our destination points. These are kind of the places we want every reader to go to, want every reader to experience, to ensure that they're having a satisfying story and it's going to make sense. But as you can see, between these islands, our reader can journey there in whatever manner they wish. So this is where we introduce our choices. We can give them different journeys and experiences. We give the reader agency, and each reader is experiencing their own sort of story in between and their own encounters. But what is ultimately important is that they're still traveling towards the same destination, which is your kind of first real major narrative story beat from your overarching story. So you can sort of see how these big islands, they help anchor your main story so that it remains coherent. Because if you don't have those, then it's very easy for, particularly when writing a game book, that your choices will just keep branching and go off in a myriad of directions. And some of those journeys that you end up going down, they could easily, you as a writer and also as the reader, it can be easy to lose sight of the story and the tension and the pacing. So islands keep you on track like a map, and the choices, think about that as the choices are just the journey to reach those islands. That's at least my methodology anyway. And finally, I know I'm probably going to be asked about open world game books, the likes of Fable Lands, Legendary Kingdoms, and how that kind of structure would sit with something like those books where the reader and the hero literally have complete freedom to hop between books and between locations. I'm obviously no authority on how you would necessarily approach one of those books, but I would imagine, again, it's probably works in a series of levels, with the top level being understanding whether there's a overarching background story to each region, and then how that would then feed into individual independent stories that the player would then experience. So I think it would just be considering how those independent stories are introduced to the reader, and within that you can then think a little bit about the pacing structure that we've already looked at, so that each individual adventure has a sort of satisfying kind of pace and tension and conclusion. And I also imagine a big thing to think about when planning an open world book is the density of these stories or quests. You wouldn't want to overwhelm your reader with lots of different starting points or inciting incidents potentially all at once, so that they're just confused about, hang on, what should I be doing, what should I be following. Try and be very conscious of that, I would have thought, just to kind of pace out pace out the kind of gaming experience. So that's it, guys. That's my kind of advice on story structure. I apologise if it was a bit deep, but I just think there's a lot there probably to sort of unpack but it's all really useful stuff, and it's stuff that's really helped me as a writer, and I hope some of it in some way helps you when you come to plan your stories. So anyway, thank you. Look forward to hearing your opinions. Please leave a comment, and yeah, hopefully I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.